Before Elvis Presley was ever crowned the king of rock and roll, Big Mama Thornton had already conquered the charts with Hound Dog. She repeated this exact miracle a decade later, writing the raw masterpiece that catapulted Janis Joplin into global superstardom. But while these icons built multi-million-dollar empires on her vocal blueprints, the American music machine systematically stripped Thornton of her royalties and mainstream recognition. The industry ruthlessly extracted her revolutionary sound to change pop culture, only to lock her out of the very mansion she helped build. She didn't just sing the blues, she lived the devastating reality of a pioneer who birthed a musical revolution, only to be left to die in the shadows. At the age of 14, Willie Mae made a definitive choice. She left home. She joined the Hot Harlem Review, a traveling vaudeville and blues troupe. She packed her few belongings and stepped onto the grueling, unforgiving path known as the Chitlin Circuit. The Chitlin Circuit was a network of venues across the United States that were safe and acceptable for black entertainers to perform in during the era of racial segregation. But safe was a relative term. The reality of traveling the circuit in the 1940s was an exhausting test of physical and mental endurance. The troupe traveled in cramped buses down dirt roads in the dead of night. They could not stop at most restaurants or sleep in most hotels. They relied on the hospitality of local black families or slept in the vehicles. They performed in hot, overcrowded juke joints, dance halls, and theaters, often playing multiple shows a night for wages that barely covered their next meal. This environment was notoriously predatory. The business of blues and rhythm and blues was controlled entirely by men. The band leaders, the booking agents, the promoters, and the club owners were men who viewed young female singers as disposable commodities. A young woman on the road was constantly vulnerable to financial exploitation and physical harassment. To survive, a female performer usually had to attach herself to a male protector, often a band leader, which brought its own set of compromises and abuses. Willie Mae refused to be a commodity. She understood the brutal mechanics of the system she had entered. She saw how soft, vulnerable women were chewed up and spat out by the industry. She decided that she would not be prey. She began to construct an impenetrable armor. This was the genesis of the persona that the world would come to know as Big Mama. The transformation was physical, psychological, and musical. Willie Mae was naturally a large woman, and rather than trying to shrink herself to fit the petite, feminine ideal favored by the pop market, she weaponized her size. She began wearing men's tailored suits, fedoras, and work boots. This was not merely an aesthetic choice. It was a deliberate strategy of intimidation. In a male-dominated world, she dressed like the men in charge. She projected an aura of absolute toughness. She drank heavily. She cursed freely. She adopted a confrontational, direct manner of speaking that left no room for disrespect. She made it abundantly clear to club owners and fellow musicians that she was not a woman to be trifled with. She also expanded her musical arsenal. Singers were easily replaceable, but musicians held power. Willie Mae taught herself to play the drums and the harmonica. These were instruments heavily associated with male bluesmen. By mastering them, she proved that she did not need to rely on a male backing band to carry her performance. She could dictate the rhythm. She could drive the melody. She possessed a deep, resonant, booming voice that she had trained over years of singing over noisy, unamplified crowds in rural juke joints. She could growl, she could shout, and she could bend notes with a fierce, percussive energy. When she stepped onto a stage, she did not ask for the audience's attention, she demanded it. Her reputation grew steadily throughout the late 1940s. She was no longer just a girl from Alabama. She was a formidable force on the Southern blues circuit. She had successfully navigated a system designed to exploit her by becoming harder and tougher than the men who ran it. But the grueling life on the road offered little in the way of financial security or permanent success. To capture the sound she had perfected and turn it into a sustainable career, she needed to record. She needed a label. In 1951, her path led her to Houston, Texas. Houston was a booming hub for rhythm and blues, and at the center of that hub was Peacock Records. The label was owned by Don Roby, a notoriously ruthless black businessman. Roby was a powerful figure in the Houston underworld. He operated the Bronze Peacock nightclub and ran his record label with an iron fist. He was known to carry a loaded handgun and reportedly used physical violence to intimidate his artists and settle contract disputes. Roby understood the market, but he viewed his artists as property. When Willie Mae Thornton walked into Don Roby's office, it was a collision of two unyielding forces. Roby saw a raw, powerful talent that could sell records to the booming black working-class market. Thornton saw an opportunity to finally capture her voice on vinyl and escape the endless grind of the vaudeville circuit. She signed a contract with Peacock Records. It was a crucial milestone, but it was also a trap. The business structure of independent R&B labels in the early 1950s was deeply exploitative. Artists were routinely denied proper royalties. Their publishing rights were taken from them, and they were paid a flat, minimal fee for their recording sessions. Thornton had built an incredible armor to protect herself from the physical dangers of the road, but she was stepping into a corporate machine designed to extract her cultural value without offering fair compensation. By the end of 1951, Willie Mae Thornton had survived the loss of her mother, the crushing weight of the Jim Crow South, and the predatory environment of the Chitlin circuit. She had forged herself into Big Mama, a persona built on defiance, physical dominance, and undeniable musical authority. She had secured a recording contract and a foothold in the industry, but the armor she wore was heavy. It isolated her, and it masked the deep scars of her childhood trauma. She was prepared to fight the men in the clubs, but she was about to face a recording industry that fought with contracts, lawyers, and systemic exclusion. The stage was set. Her voice was primed. The world was about to hear her roar, but she was completely unaware of how ruthlessly that roar would be monetized by others. The year was 1952, and the landscape of American music was beginning to shift, trembling under the weight of a post-war generation that was hungry for something louder, faster, and more dangerous. Willie Mae Thornton, now firmly established under the formidable moniker of Big Mama, was sent by Don Roby to Los Angeles. She was there to perform and record with the Johnny Otis Rhythm and Blues Caravan. Otis was a band leader and an astute talent scout, a white man who had immersed himself so deeply in black culture that he operated seamlessly within it. He commanded a tight, disciplined band that served as the engine room for the West Coast rhythm and blues sound. But even Otis's seasoned musicians were momentarily caught off guard by the sheer magnitude of Thornton's presence when she walked into the rehearsal space. She did not politely wait for direction. She dominated the room, her voice rattling the very floorboards, her demeanor daring anyone to challenge her authority. It was in this charged environment that a fateful collision occurred. Johnny Otis had invited two 19-year-old aspiring songwriters to watch the rehearsal. Their names were Jerry Leiber and Mike Stoller. They were two Jewish kids from the East Coast who had relocated to Los Angeles, deeply obsessed with black music, culture, and vernacular. They spent their days hanging around record stores and clubs, desperately trying to absorb the authenticity of the blues. When they saw Big Mama Thornton, they were paralyzed. They later described her as the most imposing human being they had ever seen. They watched her glare at the musicians, snapping her fingers, demanding a heavier groove, her voice a terrifying, magnificent instrument. Leiber and Stoller realized immediately that they could not hand this woman a standard, mournful blues ballad. She was not a victim to be pitied. She was a force of nature. They needed a song that matched the impenetrable armor she had built around herself. They rushed back to Stoller's apartment and, in less than 20 minutes, feverishly hammered out a song that was entirely tailored to the woman they had just witnessed. They called it Hound Dog. To understand the profound impact of this song, one must first strip away the cartoonish, upbeat associations it would acquire years later. In its original conception, crafted specifically for Thornton, Hound Dog was a venomous, mid-tempo blues narrative. In Southern black working-class slang, a hound dog was not a literal canine. It was a derogatory term for a specific type of man. It meant a gigolo. It meant a useless, freeloading opportunist who came around a woman's house looking for a meal, a bed, and money, while offering absolutely nothing in return. For Thornton, a woman who had spent her entire youth fighting off predatory, exploitative men in the dangerous underworld of the Chitlin circuit, these lyrics were not a playful joke. They were a visceral declaration of independence. The song was a manifesto of a woman who had drawn a line in the sand and was violently expelling a parasite from her life. The recording session took place in August of 1952 at Radio Recorders in Los Angeles, and it quickly became a legendary battle of wills. Leiber, brash, and inexperienced, attempted to instruct Thornton on how to deliver the vocal. He wanted her to sing it with a specific rhythmic bite. Thornton, possessing zero tolerance for being dictated to by a white teenager, stopped the music. She turned her imposing frame toward the control room, leveled a death glare at Leiber, and informed him in no uncertain terms that if he wanted to teach her how to sing, he could come down to the microphone and do it himself. Otherwise, he needed to sit down, shut his mouth, and let her work. She then turned back to the band, commanded the drummer to lay down a heavy, grinding beat, and began to sing. She did not merely record the song, she conquered it. Her vocal performance is a masterclass in controlled aggression. She growls, she snarls, she stretches the syllables until they snap like a whip. She interacts with the electric guitar, barking back at the instrument, treating it like the very man she is throwing out of her house. She infused the track with the trauma, the resilience, and the hardened exterior she had been forced to develop since childhood. When the playback echoed through the studio monitors, everyone in the room knew they had just captured lightning in a bottle. The track was a sonic weapon. When Peacock Records released Hound Dog in late February of 1953, the reaction was explosive. The record swept across the country, climbing the Billboard R&B charts with astonishing speed. By spring, it had hit #1, and it stayed at the summit for 7 consecutive weeks. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies. In the context of the segregated music industry, Big Mama Thornton had reached the absolute zenith. Her voice was blasting out of every jukebox in every black neighborhood, club, and barbershop in America. She had proven, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that she was a commercial powerhouse capable of driving a massive hit record. But this is where the sheer, unyielding cruelty of the 1950s American music machine revealed its true architecture. Thornton had reached the top of the mountain, only to discover that the sky above her was made of solid concrete. Despite having the biggest R&B record in the country, Thornton hit an invisible, impenetrable ceiling. The music market was strictly segregated by design. The infrastructure that created national superstars, the mainstream radio stations, the national television broadcasts, the highly capitalized distribution networks, was exclusively reserved for white artists playing pop music. White radio disc jockeys flatly refused to play race records on their stations, terrified that their conservative sponsors would pull their advertising funding. The establishment viewed Thornton's raw, unapologetic, masculine energy not as brilliant artistry, but as a cultural threat. The mainstream industry wanted female singers who were docile, manicured, and unthreatening. Big Mama Thornton was none of those things. Therefore, the system actively quarantined her success. She was allowed to be a queen, but only within the strictly bordered territory the white establishment had drawn for her. This systemic segregation was compounded by an equally ruthless economic exploitation. Hound Dog generated a massive influx of cash. But the mechanics of the recording industry ensured that the money flowed upward, entirely bypassing the woman whose voice had created the phenomenon. Thornton was not a credited songwriter. The publishing rights initially belonged to Leiber and Stoller, but the producer Johnny Otis aggressively forced his own name onto the writing credits, sparking a bitter legal battle over the publishing royalties. Thornton's compensation for delivering the performance of a lifetime was a single flat fee. She later recalled receiving a check for $500. There were no royalties. There was no passive income. She had created a cultural artifact that would resonate for decades, but she did not own a single piece of the equity. The psychological toll of this dynamic is profound. Thornton was smart enough to know exactly how much money her voice was generating for Peacock Records. She saw the packed clubs. She saw the records flying off the shelves, and yet her bank account remained virtually stagnant. The industry had validated her talent while simultaneously confirming that they viewed her labor as cheap and expendable. The armor she wore to protect herself on the road could not protect her from the legal theft orchestrated in corporate offices. To survive, to pay for her next meal and her next hotel room, she had no choice but to pack her bags and get right back onto the exhausting, brutal touring circuit. She had sung a definitive anthem about refusing to be exploited by a man, yet she found herself entirely trapped within an industry that exploited her with absolute legal impunity. As 1953 came to a close, Willie Mae Thornton stood at a painful, paradoxical crossroads. She had achieved the greatest triumph of her career. She had proven that she was not just a regional performer, but a hitmaker with a voice that could define a genre. Hound Dog had immortalized her within the rhythm and blues community. Yet, the systemic barriers of race, gender, and corporate greed had effectively locked her out of the broader cultural and financial rewards she had rightfully earned. She was forced back onto the grueling Chitlin circuit, singing her massive hit night after night to survive, while the executives who owned the rights to her voice grew wealthy while they slept. She had battered her way through the doors of the industry through sheer talent and intimidation, only to find herself wandering the exact same dirt roads she had started on. And just over the horizon, entirely unknown to her, a cultural tidal wave was building in Memphis, Tennessee, a wave that would soon take the very song she had bled for and carry it to a mainstream white market she was systematically excluded from entering. The years immediately following 1953 were a masterclass in the exhausting, repetitive reality of the American blues artist. The $500 Willie Mae Thornton had been paid for Hound Dog vanished quickly, swallowed by the relentless expenses of staying alive on the road. A hit record in the segregated rhythm and blues market did not buy a house in the suburbs, nor did it buy a comfortable retirement. It bought you a slightly better billing on the next grueling tour. Thornton found herself right back in the cramped, non-air-conditioned buses, staring out at the endless stretches of Southern Highway in the dead of night. She was still fighting for her money from crooked club promoters. She was still relying on her physical intimidation to keep predators at bay. The armor she had built, that imposing, masculine, hard-drinking persona of Big Mama, had to be worn every single day. There was no rest. There was no reprieve. She had touched the absolute pinnacle of her designated world, and the reward was simply permission to keep working until she dropped. While Thornton was grinding away in the sweaty, crowded juke joints of the Chitlin circuit, the tectonic plates of American culture were beginning to shift. The post-war economic boom had created a new demographic, the white American teenager. These teenagers had disposable income, they had radios, and they were growing profoundly bored with the sanitized, polite pop music of their parents' generation. Late at night, they were turning their radio dials, tuning into the powerful signals of black radio stations broadcasting from cities like Memphis and Chicago. They were hearing rhythm and blues. They were hearing the raw, visceral, sexually charged energy of a culture they were legally and socially separated from. The mainstream music industry, controlled entirely by white executives, saw this happening. They saw the demand. They wanted the money that this new rhythm generated, but they were terrified of the racial implications. They needed the black sound, but they needed it delivered in a safe white package. They needed a translator. In 1956, they found the ultimate translator in a young truck driver from Tupelo, Mississippi, named Elvis Presley. To understand the cruelty of what happened next, it is necessary to examine how Hound Dog traveled from Willie Mae Thornton to Elvis Presley. Elvis did not hate black people, nor did he consciously set out to steal from Thornton. He was a genuine fan of rhythm and blues, but he existed within a commercial machine that was designed to capitalize on his whiteness. Elvis did not even learn Hound Dog by listening to Thornton's original record. The song had already been filtered. Presley heard a white lounge act called Freddie Bell and the Bellboys performing a sped-up, sanitized version of the song during a residency in Las Vegas. The mutation of the song between 1953 and 1956 is a perfect, devastating metaphor for the erasure of black female identity in American pop culture. When Jerry Leiber and Mike Stoller wrote the song for Thornton, the lyrics made sense. It was a woman telling a gigolo, a parasitic man, to get out of her house. But when the White Lounge Act adapted it, they changed the lyrics. They removed the specific, grounded narrative of a black woman's domestic rebellion and turned it into a nonsensical novelty song. The lyrics were altered to, "You ain't never caught a rabbit, and you ain't no friend of mine." It was no longer about a useless man. It was literally about a dog. The song was castrated. Its teeth were pulled. The fierce confrontational independence that Thornton had breathed into the track was completely erased, replaced by a frantic, nervous, youthful energy. In July of 1956, Elvis Presley walked into RCA Studios in New York and recorded his version of Hound Dog. RCA was a corporate titan. They had the power to press millions of records and distribute them globally overnight. More importantly, Elvis had access to the most powerful new medium in the world, national television. When Elvis performed Hound Dog on The Milton Berle Show and The Ed Sullivan Show, he broadcast the song directly into the living rooms of tens of millions of white, middle-class Americans. He shook his hips, the teenagers screamed, and the song exploded. It became a cultural tidal wave. It sold millions of copies, dominating the pop, country, and R&B charts simultaneously. It made Elvis Presley a millionaire, a movie star, and the undisputed king of a newly minted genre called rock and roll. We must pause here to deeply analyze the psychological trauma inflicted upon Willie Mae Thornton during the summer of 1956. Imagine being in her shoes. She is likely sitting in a cheap motel room in the South, or waiting backstage in a dimly lit club, exhausted from years of brutal travel. She turns on a mainstream radio station, a station that flatly refused to play her voice 3 years earlier because she was black and too aggressive, and blasting from the speaker is her song, her rhythm, her groove. But the voice is white, the lyrics are nonsensical, and the world is losing its mind. This is a specific, razor-sharp type of psychological violence. It is not just about stolen money, though the financial disparity was sickening. It is about the systemic denial of existence. Thornton had served as the unpaid test subject for the American music industry. She took the risk. She proved the product was commercially viable. But the moment the product was ready for the mass market, she was discarded, and a more socially acceptable spokesperson was hired to reap the ultimate rewards. For a woman who had spent her entire life fighting to be seen, fighting to establish her authority in a world that wanted her silent and compliant, watching Elvis Presley become a global god, using the vehicle she had built, was a devastating blow. It reinforced the most painful lesson of the Jim Crow South. No matter how hard she worked, no matter how undeniable her talent was, her ceiling was always going to be a white man's floor. The industry was sending her a clear, unvarnished message. They loved her labor, they loved her innovation, but they did not want her. Thornton did not publicly weep over this. She did not complain to the press. The armor of Big Mama would not allow for public vulnerability. When asked about Elvis in later years, she would offer a tight, professional smile and acknowledge that he was a good-looking boy who sang it his way. But the internal cost was immense. When you are repeatedly denied the fruits of your own labor, you harden. Thornton drank more. The tough exterior became thicker, heavier, and more isolating. She had to build walls not just against the predatory club owners, but against an entire global industry that had looked at her métamorphoses, stripped it of its original meaning, and handed it to someone else. As the 1950s drew to a close, the landscape of American music was unrecognizable. Rock and roll had become a massive, multi-million-dollar corporate enterprise. The white teenagers who were screaming for Elvis were now driving the massive, booming American youth consumer market. The major record labels were desperately signing any young white boy with a guitar and a pompadour, hoping to replicate the Presley phenomenon. And where did that leave the architects? Where did that leave the black blues artists who had invented the foundation of this new empire? They were left behind. As the mainstream market obsessed over rock and roll, the traditional rhythm and blues market began to contract. The venues got smaller. The paychecks got thinner. Thornton found herself pushed further toward the margins. She had been the vanguard, the bleeding edge of modern music, and within a few short years, the industry had rebranded her as a relic of the past. Her recording contract with Peacock Records ended, and she found herself without a label, without steady national promotion, and without the massive wealth that should have accompanied her historical impact. She was in her early 30s, an age when mainstream pop stars are often at the peak of their wealth and power. But Willie Mae Thornton was fighting just to keep the lights on. She moved to the San Francisco Bay Area, hoping the West Coast blues scene would offer more stability than the grueling southern circuits. She went back to the only thing she knew how to do, the only thing the system could not physically take away from her. She played the clubs. She stood on stage night after night, holding a microphone, forcing audiences to feel the sheer weight of her existence. By the dawn of the 1960s, the paradox of Big Mama Thornton's life was firmly cemented. She was a living legend within the blues community, an artist of terrifying power and undisputed influence. Yet she was completely excluded from the immense financial and cultural empire that had been built directly on top of her innovations. The trauma of the hound dog phenomenon was not a sudden wound. It was a chronic, aching reminder of her precise place in the American hierarchy. She had learned that survival required a hardened shell, but that shell was beginning to take a physical and emotional toll. She was walking into a new decade, unaware that history was preparing to repeat its cruelest trick. A new generation of white youth was about to discover the blues. And once again, Willie Mae Thornton was going to write a masterpiece, only to watch a white artist carry it to the promised land. The dawn of the 1960s found Willie Mae Thornton living in the San Francisco Bay Area. She had moved away from the suffocating grip of the Jim Crow South and the brutal, endless highways of the Chitlin Circuit. California offered a different kind of existence. The racial dynamics were less overtly violent, but the economic realities of the music business remained identical. Thornton was no longer a chart-topping phenomenon. She was a working-class musician in her mid-30s, grinding out a living in local blues clubs and smoky bars. The mainstream music industry had entirely moved on, obsessed with the polished pop rock of the early decade. But Thornton did not stop working. She could not afford to stop. She was a professional. She showed up, she commanded the stage, and she collected her pay. It was during this period of grueling, unglamorous club work that Thornton sat down and wrote a masterpiece. She did not rely on teenage songwriters this time. She dug into her own lived experience. The song she crafted was called Ball and Chain. It was not a fast, upbeat dance track. It was a slow, agonizing, heavy blues composition. The musical structure was built around a plodding, deliberate rhythm, resembling the literal dragging of a heavy weight. The lyrics spoke of a romantic entrapment, a pain so profound it felt like a physical shackle. But beneath the surface narrative of a broken relationship, Ball and Chain functioned as a devastating psychological mirror for Thornton's own life. It reflected the crushing weight of her career. It captured the exhaustion of a woman who had given her unparalleled voice to an industry, only to be chained to the bottom tier of its economic hierarchy. When she sang it, she did not just perform the lyrics. She bled them out. She recognized the immense power of the song. In 1961, she took it to a small local label called Bay Tone Records to record it. This should have been the moment Thornton secured her financial future. She was the writer, she was the performer, but the mechanics of systemic exploitation in the music industry did not care about authorship. They cared about leverage, and Thornton had none. The executives at Bay Tone Records took the recording, but they did not properly release or promote it. More devastatingly, they retained the copyright to the song. Thornton, lacking a high-powered legal team and desperate for immediate cash to survive, was trapped by a piece of paper. The label essentially shelved the track, denying her both the exposure and the publishing royalties she rightfully owned. The systemic theft that had occurred with Hound Dog was repeating itself, but this time it was a more intimate violation. They were not just taking her performance, they were taking her intellectual property. The system demonstrated, yet again, that a black female artist could invent the wheel, but the men in the corporate offices would own the patent. While Ball and Chain gathered dust in a filing cabinet, the cultural landscape of America underwent another massive seismic shift. The mid-1960s brought the folk and blues revival. A new generation of affluent, white, college-educated youth began searching for authenticity. They rejected the manufactured pop music of the era and started digging through old record bins. They discovered acoustic folk, and more importantly, they discovered the rural and urban blues of Black America. Suddenly, artists who had been pushed to the absolute margins of the industry were being sought out by a demographic that had previously ignored them. Blues festivals began springing up across the country. White promoters traveled to the South and to the inner cities, tracking down legendary bluesmen and blueswomen to book them for these new, massive outdoor concerts. Thornton found herself swept up in this strange cultural tide. She was booked to play the Monterey Jazz Festival. She toured Europe with the American Folk Blues Festival package. The environment was jarringly different. Thornton was no longer playing to tough, working-class black audiences in dangerous juke joints. She was playing in concert halls and university auditoriums to thousands of young white hippies who sat cross-legged on the floor, listening in reverent silence. They treated her not as a contemporary pop star, but as a living museum exhibit. They worshipped her authenticity. They studied her guitar playing and her vocal phrasing. This newfound respect was certainly better than obscurity. It provided steady festival work and a level of critical acclaim she had been denied in the 1950s. But it is crucial to analyze the inherent limitations of this revival. The white counterculture of the 1960s consumed black blues as a form of cultural rebellion, but they did not integrate these artists into the modern commercial machinery. Thornton was revered as a pioneer, but pioneers are historical figures. The massive record contracts, the radio airplay, and the millions of dollars in tour revenue were reserved for the young white rock bands who took the blues vocabulary and amplified it through stacks of Marshall amplifiers. One of those young white singers was a woman from Port Arthur, Texas, named Janis Joplin. Joplin was an outcast in her conservative Texas hometown. She had found solace in the records of black female blues singers, particularly Bessie Smith, Odetta, and Big Mama Thornton. Joplin did not just listen to the music, she absorbed the attitude. When she moved to San Francisco and joined the psychedelic rock band Big Brother and the Holding Company, she brought that raw, unpolished, visceral vocal style with her. Joplin deeply admired Thornton's commanding stage presence and raw vocal power during the times their paths crossed within the vibrant San Francisco music scene. She watched Thornton command the room. She heard Thornton perform Ball and Chain. Joplin was transfixed by the song's heavy, agonizing power. She recognized that it was the perfect vehicle for her own explosive, desperate vocal delivery. It is important to state clearly that Janis Joplin did not steal Ball and Chain. Unlike the corporate executives who hid behind exploitative contracts, Joplin operated with a sense of artistic respect. She approached Thornton directly. She asked for permission to cover the song. Thornton, recognizing the younger singer's genuine admiration, gave her blessing. Joplin and her band took the song, electrified it, turned the tempo down to a grueling, psychedelic crawl, and made it their own. In June of 1967, Big Brother and the Holding Company performed at the Monterey Pop Festival. It was a watershed moment in American cultural history. The festival was filmed, recorded, and heavily attended by the most powerful record executives in the world. When Janis Joplin stepped to the microphone and delivered a shattering volcanic performance of Ball and Chain, the trajectory of rock music altered instantly. The performance was captured on film and became the defining image of the festival. Overnight, Janis Joplin became a global superstar. Columbia Records signed the band to a massive contract. The subsequent album, Cheap Thrills, which featured Ball and Chain, sold millions of copies and topped the Billboard charts. When Janis Joplin brought Ball and Chain to Monterey in 1967, lightning struck a second time. Yet, while Joplin catapulted to global stardom, Thornton remained tethered to the brutal economics of the club circuit, a celebrated architect still holding the blueprints, but forever denied the keys to her own creation. The dynamic between Thornton and Joplin was fundamentally different from the dynamic with Elvis Presley. Joplin publicly and loudly credited Thornton at every opportunity. She told the press, she told her audiences, and she made sure Thornton was booked as an opening act for several of her major concerts. Joplin used her newfound leverage to demand that the industry pay attention to the woman who had written the song. But public credit does not dismantle a rigged economic system. The acknowledgement from a younger white star, while respectful, highlighted the grotesque disparity of the music business. Janis Joplin was securing the cover of national magazines, earning vast sums of money, and achieving an exalted status in the cultural zeitgeist. Willie Mae Thornton was being handed an opening slot on the tour. The psychological weight of this specific era cannot be overstated. For Thornton, lightning had struck the exact same spot twice. In 1953, she had provided the blueprint for the biggest male solo artist in rock and roll history. In 1967, she provided the breakout vehicle for the biggest female solo artist in rock and roll history. She was the architect of the sound that was generating unprecedented wealth for the American recording industry. Yet, her own financial situation remained precarious. The issue was not a lack of talent. It was not a lack of public acceptance. It was the harsh reality of corporate ownership. Because Baytone Records had held the initial copyright to Ball and Chain, the sudden explosion of the song's popularity resulted in a tangled web of legal disputes over publishing royalties. Even when her own compositions sold millions of copies, the structural barriers of the industry prevented the money from flowing directly and cleanly into Thornton's bank account. She was forced to hire lawyers and fight for scraps of the equity she had created from her own mind. As the 1960s ended, Thornton was trapped in a highly visible paradox. She was a recognized legend. The greatest guitarists and singers of the rock era spoke her name with reverence. But reverence does not buy leverage. She did not have a high-powered manager demanding a multi-album deal from a major label. She did not have the marketing machinery that could package her for the mainstream market. Her physical size, her masculine attire, and her absolute refusal to compromise her tough, uncompromising personality meant that the pop industry still viewed her as an unmarketable outsider. She was the foundation of the house, but she was not permitted to live in the penthouse. While the rock bands flew on private jets and bought sprawling estates in the Hollywood Hills, Big Mama Thornton packed her bags, grabbed her harmonica, and got back into the van. The festival circuit was lucrative enough to keep her alive, but it demanded constant physical labor. She had to sing the blues every single night to survive, completely aware that the industry was making millions off the exact same notes being sung by someone else. By the close of the 1960s, Willie Mae Thornton had witnessed two distinct revolutions in American popular music. She had supplied the fuel for both of them. She had navigated the brutal racism of the segregated 1950s market, and she had navigated the patronizing, well-intentioned cultural appropriation of the 1960s counterculture. She had proven that she was not just a singer, but a songwriter of immense depth. Yet, as she moved into her 40s, the physical toll of her relentless work ethic and her heavy drinking began to catch up with her. The music industry had established a clear pattern. They would gladly extract her genius, they would accept her historical influence, but they would never grant her the commercial power to dictate her own terms. She was walking into the final chapters of her life holding the undisputed respect of her peers, but carrying the heavy, agonizing burden of an industry's systemic failure. The 1970s arrived with a cold, unforgiving reality for the pioneers of American rhythm and blues. The cultural euphoria of the 1960s counterculture, which had briefly elevated traditional blues artists to the status of revered sages, began to evaporate. The music industry was undergoing another massive corporate consolidation, pivoting rapidly toward the polished, highly produced sounds of disco and the bloated, stadium-filling spectacle of arena rock. The blues festival circuit, which had provided Willie Mae Thornton with a lifeline of steady, respectful work, began to shrink. The young, white audiences who had sat cross-legged at Monterey listening to her raw vocal power were now buying tickets to see bands playing in massive concrete domes. The industry had successfully extracted the raw ore of the blues, refined it into a globally marketable product, and discarded the original miners. Thornton was entering her 50s. For a woman who had spent nearly 4 decades traversing the unforgiving landscape of the Chitlin Circuit, surviving predatory club owners, systemic racism, and the grueling physical demands of endless travel, age was not merely a number. It was an accumulation of profound, untreated trauma. She did not have the luxury of a secure retirement. She did not have a sprawling estate funded by decades of publishing royalties. The American music business had structurally ensured that her historical influence would never translate into generational wealth. Therefore, she had to keep working. The tragic, inescapable math of her existence dictated that if she stopped singing, she would simply stop surviving. It is here that we must deeply examine the mechanism of her coping strategy. Willie Mae Thornton drank. She drank heavily. In traditional sanitized musical biographies, substance abuse is often framed as a personal failing, a tragic flaw that derails a promising career. But to view Thornton's alcoholism through a lens of moral judgment is to entirely misunderstand the crushing psychological weight of her reality. Alcohol was not a party favor. It was an anesthetic. It was a required medication to numb the profound cognitive dissonance of her daily life. Imagine the psychological torture of walking past a record store and seeing an album by Janis Joplin or Elvis Presley, albums containing the very DNA of your soul, generating millions of dollars for corporate executives, and then having to board a cramped bus to play a smoky, half-empty club just to afford your next month's rent. The alcohol was a shield against the insurmountable grief of being historically significant but economically invisible. It was the only way to soften the sharp, jagged edges of an industry that had repeatedly looked her in the eye, acknowledged her genius, and then handed her a pittance. But the body keeps an uncompromising score. The armor of Big Mama, the imposing physical mass, the masculine swagger, the terrifying physical presence that she had meticulously constructed as a young woman to protect herself from the predators of the Jim Crow South began to fail her. Decades of relentless touring, combined with the ravages of severe chronic alcoholism, triggered a catastrophic physical collapse. Her liver began to fail. Her heart grew weak. The physical transformation was not a gradual decline. It was a shocking, violent erosion of her physical form. The woman who had proudly weighed well over 300 pounds, who had used her massive silhouette to command absolute authority in rooms full of dangerous men, began to wither. She lost an astonishing amount of weight, eventually dropping to under 100 pounds. This physical deterioration added a devastating new layer to her tragedy. When your entire survival strategy, your entire professional persona, is built upon the premise of physical intimidation and unbreakable strength, what happens when your body betrays you? The loss of her physical mass was the loss of her primary defense mechanism. The world could finally see the fragile, exhausted human being beneath the myth of Big Mama. Yet, even as her body practically turned to ash, her spirit refused to capitulate. The live footage and eyewitness accounts of Thornton's performances in the late 1970s and early 1980s are profoundly difficult to process, straddling the line between agonizing heartbreak and awe-inspiring triumph. She was often too weak to stand. She had to be physically assisted onto the stage by her bandmates. She would perform her sets seated in a folding chair, looking frail, gaunt, and completely stripped of the physical power that had defined her youth. But then she would bring the microphone to her lips. The voice that emerged from that failing skeletal frame defied all medical and logical explanation. It was still there. The deep, resonant, earth-shattering power of her vocal cords remained entirely intact. She could still growl. She could still bend a blue note until it snapped. She could still silence a crowded room with a single guttural moan. It was a terrifying, magnificent display of sheer human will. She was singing not just to entertain, but to defiantly announce her continued existence. Every note she belted out from that chair was a refusal to be erased by the industry that had systematically tried to bleed her dry. She was forcing the audience to look at the collateral damage of American musical history. She was standing in the wreckage of her own body, demanding that her voice be heard. During this era, a grim, ironic contrast played out on the global stage. In 1970, Janis Joplin died of an overdose in a Hollywood hotel room, crushed by the isolating weight of the massive fame she had achieved. In 1977, Elvis Presley died in his sprawling Graceland mansion, his body destroyed by prescription drugs, entirely isolated from reality by his unprecedented wealth and global superstardom. Both of the artists who had taken Willie Mae Thornton's music to the stratosphere died tragically young, consumed by the very commercial empires that were built upon Thornton's foundation. Thornton outlived them both. She survived the stars who had eclipsed her. But survival, in her context, was a grueling war of attrition. She did not have a Graceland to retreat to. She did not have a massive record label protecting her legacy. She lived in a modest boarding house in Los Angeles, her health deteriorating daily, still accepting bookings at local blues clubs because the systemic theft of her publishing rights meant she had no safety net. She was a living ghost, wandering through the margins of an industry that had long since moved on to synthesizers and music videos. In the summer of 1984, the physical bill finally came due. Willie Mae Thornton suffered a massive heart attack and died in a Los Angeles boarding house. She was 57 years old. The reaction from the mainstream music industry to her passing was a masterclass in institutional hypocrisy. There were no national days of mourning. There were no multi-million-dollar televised tributes. There were brief, respectful obituaries tucked into the back pages of music magazines, acknowledging her as a pioneer and inevitably identifying her in the headline as the woman who sang Hound Dog before Elvis Presley. Even in death, the media could not evaluate her life without using a white man as the metric for her relevance. She was buried in Inglewood Park Cemetery, her funeral attended by a small group of devoted blues musicians and friends who understood the true magnitude of what the world had just lost. If the story simply stops at her grave, it reads as a standard, depressing narrative of an exploited artist. But to truly honor Willie Mae Thornton, we must rigorously dissect the profound paradox of her legacy. We must answer the central question: was she actually forgotten? The complicated truth is that she was not forgotten. She was violently minimized. Her name is known to music historians. Her original recording of Hound Dog was eventually inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame. She is frequently cited in documentaries about the roots of rock and roll. But this type of academic institutional recognition is a cold, sterile substitute for the vibrant, lucrative, mass cultural adulation that she was rightfully owed during her lifetime. The tragedy of Big Mama Thornton is not that she vanished from the history books. It is the staggering, unbridgeable chasm between the cultural shifts she initiated, the immense corporate wealth those shifts generated, and the tiny, insulting fraction of reward that actually found its way back into her hands. She was the primary architect standing at the most critical intersection in the history of modern music, the exact moment where rural, black rhythm and blues mutated into the global phenomenon of rock and roll. She provided the blueprint for the attitude, the vocal phrasing, the confrontational energy, and the raw emotional honesty that would define rock music for the next half-century. But the American music industry, functioning perfectly within the parameters of its racist and patriarchal design, decided that the architect could not be the landlord. They took her attitude, but they decided it was only marketable when performed by a white man shaking his hips on television. They took her agonizing, deeply personal songwriting, but they decided it was only universally palatable when screamed by a white hippie at a psychedelic rock festival. They took the raw ore of her suffering, polished it into a commercial diamond, and locked it in a vault that she was legally barred from entering. When we look back at Willie Mae Thornton, we must reject the patronizing urge to pity her. Pity is a passive emotion that absolves the system of its guilt. Thornton did not view herself as a victim. She viewed herself as a boss. She fought tooth and nail for every inch of respect she received. She walked into rooms full of dangerous men and demanded they play to her tempo. She stared down white record executives and refused to be told how to sing her own soul. Her life demands outrage, not pity. It demands a clear-eyed recognition of how the mechanics of cultural appropriation actually function. The theft is rarely a single dramatic event. It is a slow, legalistic, bureaucratic process of exclusion. It is contracts written in impenetrable legalese. It is radio stations refusing to play a record based on the color of the artist's skin. It is the quiet, unspoken agreement among corporate executives that certain artists are meant to be originators, while others are designated to be stars. To summarize Willie Mae Thornton by saying she was the woman who sang Hound Dog before Elvis is to participate in her ongoing erasure. That sentence is a cage. It shrinks a towering, brilliant, complex musical genius into a mere footnote in someone else's biography. The true, unvarnished history is this. Big Mama Thornton was a titanic force of nature who bent the trajectory of American music to her will. She forged a path through the most hostile, oppressive conditions imaginable, using nothing but the sheer, terrifying power of her voice and the unbreakable armor of her spirit. She was repeatedly robbed of her financial equity, her publishing rights, and her rightful place on the global stage, but she absolutely refused to surrender her dignity. She sang until her body literally could not hold her upright, proving that while an industry can steal a woman's royalties, it can never extract her soul. She did not just precede the rock and roll revolution. She built the very stage upon which it was performed. And the fact that she was never allowed to stand in the center of that stage, under the brightest lights, receiving the wealth and adoration she had single-handedly generated, remains one of the most profound and unforgivable crimes in the history of American art.